Our first speaker, Ian Underwood, is a man who needs no introduction. He didn't give me one. Please.
Thank you.
Yay, Ian.
So, how many people know what happened in Croydon a couple of years ago? How many people have heard either Jody or myself talk about it before? Okay, so you guys actually do know what happened. Excellent. So,
You mean what Hope Damon has been saying isn't true?
Perish the thought.
yeah. So how do I just tell you to move forward, or for these, how do I
Yes.
drive out? So, go ahead, first slide. So in a book that I wrote a little while ago called The Libertarian Case for Public Schools, there is one in case you didn't know. I talked about something I call the travesty of the umbrella, which I take to be the central problem that we face regarding schools and many other things. And it's basically, where it relates to school, if you can call something school, then it gets shoved under this umbrella and it gets subsidized forever. And that's how this works, right? So if we can get therapy called school instead of therapy, then it's part of school. If we can get social work and hobbies and entertainment and community spirit, if we can call them school, then they are paid for by school taxes and nobody ever gets to say anything about it because, of course, it's your right to have all this stuff. And the reason I want to give this talk is I think we have an opportunity right now. It's something that I'll mention in a moment that looks like a problem, at least to some people, but I think if it's handled the right way and we make use of it, it could be an amazing opportunity to start pulling some of these boxes back out. So next slide. So I guess you guys all know what happened in Croydon. I don't really have to go through it, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights just to lead up to the point I want to make. But basically, there is a book about it. And, the idea is we proposed a budget instead of a ransom. It got passed by the original town meeting. And then there was a huge fear and smear campaign to overturn it, which we were really not prepared for, just the storm that we were going to get. So, next slide. So this was a pamphlet that I handed out. So you probably heard a lot of stuff about, the meeting. It was way underattended. The room was filled with Free Staters. There was a freak snowstorm. And the funny thing is, you can go back and check the records, and we did, and you find out that it was a typical meeting. Same number of people that have been there for the whole time we've been living there. It's the same people. In fact, there were 3, by actual count, Free Staters in the room. And if those people had all left, the votes would have not changed. Nothing would have changed. So, however, there was a pamphlet. And so people read this pamphlet while they were waiting for the meeting to start, and it actually changed their minds about what was going on. And it's based on 3 graphs. And in case you haven't, who's seen the 3 graphs you think that I'm going to show you? Okay, good, because I think everybody needs to see these graphs, okay? First graph. This is 4th grade NAEP reading for some particular year, okay? NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is the test which is created by the education establishment to say, here's how you'll know what kind of job we're doing, okay? And so this is what kind of job they're doing, and there's a few interesting things to note about this. So each of these dots represents a state in the United States, Kentucky, New Hampshire, Nevada, whatever. There's a score, and all the scores are basically the same. They're really not distinguishable. They will often show you these on a graph that only covers this much. And so it looks like there's some differences, but there really isn't. And the really interesting thing about this is the passing score on this, I believe, is 250. So no school is passing. Some schools are failing less badly than others. Some states are failing less badly than others, but no state is getting a passing score on any NAEP test, and hasn't been for quite a while. So this graph, I look at this, and I think there's a question that we all want to ask, which is how much should we be spending on schools, on students? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. 7,000, 25,000. you get the same results. So that's just not the right question to be asking. Next. So the next graph, has anybody not seen this graph before? Raise your hand. Okay, excellent. This is a graph put together by Andrew Coulson at Cato. However, the fact that he's at Cato doesn't matter because this is the U.S. Department of Education's numbers. Okay, he's just making a picture. And what it shows is corrected, adjusted for inflation, over the course of 40, 50 years, we have seen costs triple. That's real dollars. This is not any, inflationary effects. This is real dollars. And what we've seen is essentially zero or some negative change in student achievement, as measured by the test, which was created by the education establishment to say, here's how you'll know what a good job we're doing. That's the kind of job they're doing, okay? So when you look at that, one of the other questions that people ask a lot is, well, how much more would we need to spend? Right? We're not spending enough. How much more would we need to spend? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. We can spend all the money. And if we don't change what's going on, it won't make any difference. So the third graph, which is my favorite. So these dots, the blue dots, represent every district in New Hampshire and what they were spending. Again, this is adjusted for inflation, so these numbers are directly comparable. This is what they were all spending before the Claremont decision, and this is what they're spending 20 years later. Okay? So you can see there's one outlier here, which is Waterville Valley.
Per student cost.
This is, per student. And so it used to be around $5,000, okay? And now it's around 15, closer to 20, edging up every year, okay? And again, there's an interesting thing, which is you can draw a horizontal line right in between there. Every district is now spending more than any district was before, in real dollars, in inflation-adjusted dollars. So every district in New Hampshire is, by pre-Claremont standards, a rich district, or at least spending like one. Okay, and so again, you look at this and you just, what these three graphs together, I hope you see, what they tell you is if you are trying to fix education and you are talking about money, you are just asking the wrong questions. And the thing about the wrong question is even if you get the right answer to the wrong question, it's still the wrong answer. So my goal with these three graphs was to get people to see that, we need to stop talking about money. If you're talking about money, let's stop and let's talk about something else. Well, so what else should we talk about? So next slide. And just before we go on, anybody recognize this? The Monty Python thing? Oh, when I was a kid, okay? One of the things that happens in discussions about education is people frequently go, oh, when I was a kid, everything was better. In the old days, everything was fine. All the kids were reading. Everybody was above average. And it turns out what NAEP tells us, and the beauty of a longitudinal test like NAEP is, there were no good old days. Things sucked 50 years ago. They suck now. They have sucked the same amount in between. And by that I mean less than half the kids in school can read at proficiency, and less than half of them can do math at proficiency. And that's how it's been. People in school, I probably didn't notice it when I was a kid because I wasn't paying attention. Many of you may have not have paid attention because everything was going great for you. But this is what's been going on basically forever. So next. So these are, what you didn't hear is that what I was trying to do by proposing a budget instead of a ransom was really to force a discussion. There are a bunch of very, very fundamental questions about education which simply do not get acknowledged, let alone asked, let alone answered, under the ransom model of school funding, where they just come to you and say, this is what we want, give it to us or we'll take your house, right? And so by saying instead, here's a number, which is what we did, we said here's a number that clearly by any measure you could think of would be sufficient to educate kids, why don't you make it work? And if they were going to do that, they would have to think about questions like this, the main one being, what is the purpose of tax-funded education, which is an amazing discussion to try to have with people. I, for instance, in answering this, I said, well, here's one possible answer, and I quoted the state Supreme Court. And people just started saying, that's a crazy free stater idea. That's not a reasonable just like, okay, I didn't make this up, I couldn't be more mainstream in my choice of answer. So what I was trying to do was to get this discussion going. That was the point of this. And this was lost. They really thought it was about money. It was not about money. It's about education. It's about trying to figure out what's actually going on, how we can move the focus from what's outside the kid to what's inside the kid, and how we can actually do something better for children. You know, essentially, it's nice to save money, but the point is you can only get a better education, I believe, by spending less. You can't get one by spending more, because you don't really change anything. And until you answer questions like this, you don't even know what success means. How do we even know whether schools are succeeding or failing? Well, this general sense that they're failing, but we don't even know what we're trying to do. And so, I don't know if any of you know Zig Ziglar is a motivational coach. He died. Wasn't motivated enough, I guess. But Zig Ziglar had this quote that I love, which is, if you aim at nothing, you will hit it every time. And I cannot think of a more succinct, more accurate description of the public school system. We have no idea what it is we're trying to do, so we could only succeed, if at all, by accident. And that plan isn't working out so well. Next. So, long story short, we did not have the discussion that I wanted to have because it turned into a conversation about these horrible free staters who just want to shut everything down and they hate kids, and that was the whole discussion, right? And this is despite the fact that I had for years been writing stuff and publishing stuff about how to actually fix the schools, what it would look like if we were serious about education, none of which said, let's shut the whole thing down. And this is despite the fact that throughout the whole conversation that ended up, there were the only people who seemed to be concerned that the kids can't read and do math were the free staters. And just to give you a sense of how crazy things got, after all of that stuff happened, the next year I went back to the next year's budget meeting. And I said, okay, they were asking for the same amount of money. They were going to do the same thing, which is to say they're going to end up with, like 22 out of 30 kids who are not just not proficient and not just approaching proficiency, but like at the lowest possible measurable level of proficiency. And they were just going to do it all over again. I said, okay, look, you can have pajama day, you can have skis and violins, and you can send kids on trips. Do whatever you want, but how about we add some money to the budget to pay for reading specialists? So whatever else you feel like doing over there, the kids will learn to read. And I kid you not, the next two people who stood up said, I am so tired of these free staters who just want to cut taxes and close the schools. And then sat down. This is the level of conversation that we're having, right? I'm the only one there saying, let's add money to get the kids to read, and literally not hearing it. So next. So we kept, Jody, who was chair of the school board, my wife Jody, actually kept asking point blank, look, if we can't do everything that we've always been doing, what are your academic priorities?
I said just priorities.
Okay, just what are your priorities, right? And there were no academic priorities. The only thing anybody seemed concerned about were transportation. Am I going to have to take my kids to school, or are you going to pick them up? They were concerned about sports and extracurriculars. They were concerned that their kids would still get to be with their friends. And they were concerned about vocational training. Sometimes, a few parents were. My kid wants to learn to weld. Okay, so next. So too late, but better late than never, I realized something that at first it was just like, oh, what do they want? And I realized, no, they were telling us exactly what they want, which is they didn't want a school at all.
Daycare.
What they wanted is a community center, okay? That's really what they were asking for, and it is, if you then look at that umbrella, it is largely what they have managed to turn schools into, a giant community center. We in Croydon have a superintendent who has been for years lobbying to build a new building so that we can make the school the heart of the community. And it's like, I'm sorry, that's not what the school is for. That would be a community center. The school is where kids actually learn to read and write and reason and think their way into being citizens. So in the book, the Croydon book, I actually go a little bit at length on this, but it occurred to me that this might be a way out of the hole that we've been digging, which is simply to start separating things and saying, this goes into school, This goes in a community center. This goes in a school. This goes in a community center, right? And then you fund the schools with school taxes, and you find some other way to fund the community center that isn't, being dressed up as a right, a constitutional right. So next. And the reason I bring it up now is there is currently in play, I think it's still in play, this SB 343, which is another attempt to say, let's take some medical stuff and drag it under that umbrella. Okay, let's actually move clinics into schools. We're using them for everything else. Why don't we just use them as medical clinics too? And yeah. And this is based on, the CDC is pushing this whole school, whole community, whole child agenda. And I think the normal response to this would be for people to mobilize like T cells and try to just kill it. Okay, but it'll come back. Or they'll try to maybe tweak it. And what I want to suggest to all of you who are in fact state reps or who have any kind of influence this way is to seize this as an opportunity to change the discussion from should we do this thing to what should we be doing in schools? What are schools actually for? Okay? And abstract that, generalize it, and actually start saying, use this as an opportunity to start picking up all these boxes under the umbrella and go, does this actually go here? No, I don't think it does, right? So every bill that ever comes up like this from now on, I would suggest, is an opportunity to do this kind of thing. So next slide. And so in fact, you end up with something where you're saying, reading, writing, rhetoric, math, logical reasoning, statistical reasoning, those all belong in school. And things like daycare, transportation, nutrition, therapy, sports, music, hobby, vocations, those belong in community centers, right? So the question, of course, then comes up. You know that there are going to be people saying, oh, well, sports develops character, and that's important, and music develops something, that's important. So fortunately, the state Supreme Court, in its Claremont decision, which caused a lot of those problems, so next slide, they actually gave us a very bright line between what goes in school and what doesn't. Namely, an education, as opposed to whatever you call this stuff, is supposed to provide students with the opportunity to acquire the knowledge and learning necessary to participate intelligently in the American political, economic, and social systems of a free government. And so you can look at things like this and say, to participate in the political system especially, should you be able to read and write? Yes. Anybody think you shouldn't? No? How about understand a basic statistical argument? How about detect a specious argument or construct a solid logical argument? You should be able to do all these things, right? How about throw a fastball? If you can't play a particular sport, are you prevented from participating in any of these? I think you're not. And so you just hold every single thing up and say, necessary, not necessary. And there will be people who try to make that case, and so here's an even simpler way to think about it. If something is necessary, if you really need it to be a citizen, then it should be mandatory. And if it's not mandatory, it doesn't belong in schools. If it's not important enough that everybody needs to learn it, then it goes in the community center bin, right? And not in the school bin. So at this point, I'm almost done. At this point, I think some of you are thinking, that guy's crazy. And some of you are thinking, that guy's not crazy enough. But some of you are thinking, this isn't such a bad idea, but it will never, ever happen. Because forces will mobilize, which is what's described in the Croydon book. Just these storms just coming at you. And so, what can you do about it? And so, for the people who are thinking, this could never happen, I would like this to happen, but it can't happen. Next slide. I would like to remind you of a brief history of constitutional carry. When I was a kid, and I think when many of you were kids, the idea that any normal person could just strap on a gun and go out of his house and go wherever he wants was, not to put too fine a point on it, insane, right? And now, that is the law in more than half the states and counting. And so, basically, what happened here? What happened here is back then, some people started to change the conversation. The conversation used to be about this question: who are you to carry a gun? And now the conversation is about, who are you to tell me I can't carry a gun? Right? It changed. It didn't happen overnight, But it happened because people started asking those questions and making those points and bringing them up over and over until they started to seem normal rather than nuts. Okay? And so what I'm suggesting is you take bills like SB 343 and you use them as an opportunity to start changing the question that we ask about schools from this. The current question is, well, what else can we use schools for? And it should be, how can we make schools again? But it won't start unless we start. So, huh? Books. Oh, we have, my publisher has some books in case you would like to buy them. We have 3 of them. One is about the Croydon situation, which is highly entertaining and very useful for anybody who's going to go out and try to change the world. The second one is called Rethinking Fairness in Education, which is an expansion of some of the ideas I just touched on here, but it's actually a different way of thinking about what it means to be fair.
Which
Because
one is banned?
the
Croydon budget
the
back.
Croydon budget was banned in the
banned?
Londonderry. Somebody tried to donate it to Londonderry and they banned
Now
it.
you're
We-
right.
we don't-
I know.
only people banning books.
Yeah, right, yeah,
My
sorry.
title.
Yeah. So yeah, so you can't. It's and the third one. So the libertarian case for public schools is also just it's a way of thinking about for people who, you know, you think libertarians are all like, oh, we shouldn't do anything, we should close everything down. But it turns out, especially if you look at the New Hampshire Constitution, which is a remarkable document, there are some very good reasons for having some publicly funded education, but only some and for very specific reasons. And those 2 books are sort of, they come at the same subject from 2 different directions. So you can see her about that. Does anybody have any questions? Questions, comments, anything you want to throw at me? Yes?
I've heard arguments, well, the counter between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, Republicans are, I want education for the children, right? I want $3,000 a year for education, for math, for literate, things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the argument for the Democrats. The Democrats are, I want every single school teacher to have $1 million and be able to live worry-free.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between educating the children and paying for the children and paying for the school, the building, the union negotiated contracts,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to not have 10-hour days. Not saying that they do, and not saying that they are not suffering. They do. They have very compelling arguments, and they do have compelling stories. But the question is, which do you fund? Do you fund the education, or do you fund the way to educate? So that's my question. to you.
Okay.
So which one are we looking at?
So I'm going to tell you what I just said, which is that's the wrong question. You should not be asking, what should we fund? How should we fund it? How much money should it be? Where should it come from? Who should it go to? That is the wrong question because it doesn't make any difference. Here's what you want to be asking. What is it we're trying to do? And why are we trying to do it? And how will we know if we've actually done it? And what should we do if we pay people to do it and they don't do it? Okay, those are the questions that you need to be asking, right? So you go to have have tires put on your car. And you go in and you give the guy cash, and then you come back later and he's put 3 tires on and one of them's the wrong size. And you're like, well, that's not what you were supposed to do. He's like, oh, sorry, I spent all the money. You could come back, later and I'll try again, right? That's school. Anywhere else in society, you don't pay until the job's done. And if the job isn't done properly, you get a refund, right? And so VLAX, there's a one lone spot in the education model, which is VLAX, the Virtual Learning Academy Charter School. They don't get paid unless the kid learns something. It's like, why are not all schools working this way, okay? But notice I don't have to mention a dollar figure. I don't have to talk about what kind of tax I'm using. That's a question that we should be answering. What should happen if you pay a bunch of people to do something and they don't do it? Okay? But also, you look at things like just the assumption, everybody has the assumption that you're going to send these kids to these schools. And it's like, why? Okay? So I like to use the example of the arcade. Anybody remember like video arcades that you would go to because who could afford, your own video games? You couldn't, so you had to share them. They put them in a building, everybody goes and shares them. Now, nobody goes to video arcades except as a sort of nostalgic thing. Because whatever you think they have, you have something 10 to 100 times better in your house. There is no reason for you to go there. So if you built schools because at one time things like paper and chalkboards and chalk and pencils and teachers were expensive, so we'd better all go to brick and mortar places to share them, that's like a video arcade. Why are we even doing it, right? Before we talk about what we're going to pay for, why don't we talk about what it is that we have available to us to use without first thinking about the cost. So this is the habit I want to get everybody out of, is don't think about the money. Think about what it is we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, how we'll know whether we've done it or not, whether it should be the same thing for all kids or different for all kids, whether poor people should be paying for rich people without, saying who you're doing anything for. But it's just, that is the way the conversation has to change. What is supposed to happen there, right? Without it, just forget about money and just ask what should be happening there. If there's even a there, should there even be a there, right? If the focus changes from the physical location to this, right? And so the thing I will say often is, money is really good for changing what's happening outside of a kid. But education is about changing what's happening inside the kid, okay? And that's what we need to be focusing. I think he was first. Yes.
What are your thoughts on special education? I know in Claremont, I went to the Deliberative recently, they showed us a pie chart that made it clear that we were spending almost as much money on special education for a very small number of students as we were spending on all the rest of the students.
I mean, I think the answer, the question contains its own answer. Special education is special. And to build a system where you are trying to make everything special, it's sort of like, so there's an example I like to use. Imagine you work at a factory and you haven't been replaced by a robot yet, but cars are coming down. Your job is to put a radio in. And every car that shows up, it's basically ready for you. You put some wiring harnesses in, you do this, screw some things in, and it goes on. And you can do hundreds of cars a day. On the other hand, suppose that any car could show up, and some cars show up already complete, some cars show up, they don't even have the frame, some cars show up, something's been done wrong, and you have to deal with everything as a special case. You can't get anything done. If we are going to do things like, say, let's have a school, because there are times when everybody who is at the same level of readiness and has comparable levels of ability, we could put them in a room and teach 30 of them at once, or 50, or in colleges, 200 of them at once. That's not, it's not compatible with the idea that now we have to change what happens on that sort of assembly line situation so that anything can be dealt with. It's just, it's an abusive process, really. So I think special education should be handled specially. And when things don't fit into a sort of, very efficient, streamlined system, you don't change the system. You find ways to get kids ready to get into the system at some point. So I think of special education, the short answer is, I think of special education as preparatory rather than part of the normal process. That you get kids ready to be able to do what all the kids are doing. And if you can't get to that point, then you find somewhere else, some other way to deal with that. And a big part of that is figuring out, that they use the word appropriate a lot. They're entitled to an appropriate education. And sometimes there's just kids who have trouble reading and they need help to get to the point where they jump in. Maybe they're 6 years older than the other kids they're with, but now they can make progress the same way as everybody else is. Maybe there are kids who are never going to be able to add 2-digit numbers. What's appropriate for them, right? So that's one of the questions that we should be asking. Apart from money, put the budget aside and just say, what is appropriate? And what do we mean by appropriate? And how do we determine whether that's appropriate? Because right now, nobody has any idea. You have chaos, and whoever can make the case for getting something paid for.
Special ed directors know.
Yeah, they know. Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. I mean, I don't think you're really fully addressing his question.
Did I address your question?
Yeah, no, I think it's important because you could fix the mainstream system, but still end up with a lot of the cost problems in can also address the special ed system, because it's a huge cost.
It's an unfunded
Right.
mandate too.
It is a huge problem, but I think the basic thing that makes it so unwieldy and so disastrous is you're trying to actually take something which is designed to be streamlined and efficient, and you're actually using that as an excuse to make it less efficient. So a process where a bunch of kids are supposed to get together and learn about fractions or American history or whatever, where on some days one of the kids has a meltdown and the other 29 kids have to get up and leave the room for 45 minutes. That's special, but it's not education. Okay? And I think we just have to take those terms seriously. The whole idea of special education is it's not part of regular education. And if you try to treat them the same and you try to put them together, so, the example I like to use is ammonia, really good cleaner. Chlorine bleach, really good cleaner. They'd be even better if we put them together, right? Okay, that's special education and education together. It's a toxic mess. Yes?
So, I'm also hearing the reason why these kids are not doing well, or they're failing, or they're not reaching proficiency, it's the parents' fault. It's not the teacher's fault. Parents aren't engaged, or parents don't participate and help them, or whatever, it's the parents' fault.
Okay. And it's been that way for 50 years. So, okay, what can you do about that? If you actually decide that that's true, and you have some way to figure out if that's true, I actually think there is something to that. For instance, I'm coming around to the position that you shouldn't even teach reading in school. You should have parents teach their kids to read, and then they're ready to go to school. Because parents seem to be able to do it, and schools don't seem to be able to do it. So, I don't know what you do about that, but first you have to establish whether it's true. Do you have any data to support this, right? But what you can't do is say, this is a modern thing. Oh, nowadays, parents aren't paying enough attention to their kids. Because in 1970, you know what? Same test scores, same everything. Whatever's happening now is happening then in terms of achievement. And so it's really easy. People constantly want to say, oh, it's Common Core, it's special education, it's this, it's that. It's not. There were no good old days. Okay? Whatever's happening now was happening then. And so you have to be able to blame it. If you want to blame something now, you have to make a case for that it was the same then. And if it's always that parents don't care, maybe what you do is, I don't know. I mean, what would you do? If it just turns out the parents don't care, maybe you start treating education like a right instead of an entitlement. And that's one of the questions that was on the sheet. If a kid wants to learn something, who can stop him? Okay, and anybody who's dealt with kids knows this, especially now, right? Where you have an internet, and for anything you want to learn to bake croissants, you want to learn to play the cello, you want to learn calculus, whatever there are thousands of people who are lined up to help you for free just because they want to help you, right? And if you want to learn something, and nobody can stand in your way. On the other hand, you get a kid who doesn't want to learn something. Anybody know how to teach a kid who doesn't want to learn something? I mean, the Army does it because they say you either learn this or we throw you in prison. And we could take that approach. We're sort of taking it now. But, I think...
But then, at the same time, they chastise people who homeschool their kids that, oh my God, they're not teaching them the right things. I mean,
Right. So
when parents
right.
are involved, they complain,
Right.
and when parents aren't involved, they complain.
So again, a lot of this, I think, comes back to the discussion we're not having, which is, what is the nature of publicly funded or just education, right? If you look at the Constitution, the state Constitution, it actually says that you want to have education so that you can preserve a free government. Just like the Second Amendment to the federal Constitution says you want people to be armed so they can, preserve a free state. It's the same idea. Personally, I think we should be treating those the same. I think arms and education are exactly the same. They are both the tools that you use to keep the government from tyrannizing you, and to put the government in charge of either of those is crazy. Okay, that's my view. But you would have to convince people of that. Right now, I would say the nature of your question shows how little we've even talked about what we're supposed to be doing. Are we supposed to be educating kids against their will? Is that actually the mandate? Or is it to say Anybody who wants to learn should have an opportunity to learn. Those lead to two completely different systems, right? One of them might look something like Medicaid, where it's like parents who can educate their kids, they do it. And some parents who say, well, my kid wants to learn, but I can't afford this or I can't afford this. It's like, okay, we'll give you the educational equivalent of food stamps, right? You could do that, but we would have to be clear on what it is we're trying to do. And that's the discussion that I'm hoping people will go out and try to stir up. What are we trying to do? Because if you don't know the answer to that question, you have no idea who to blame for what, or what should be done here or there, or who should pay for it. You can't answer any of those questions until you've decided. What is it we're trying to do and why? So, I mean, does that answer your question?
I'm gonna cut it off
All right,
here.
yes.
You guys are gonna stay here,
Yes,
right?
I'll be here.
So
We can talk
we
as much
can
as you
talk
want.
to you afterwards.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.